Hi, I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. In the next few presentations, I'm going to go over a concept that will be very important for our investigation of biblical texts and their intersection with surrounding religions and myth systems. There is a part of critical historical studies called form criticism, where scholars have used the oral tradition to investigate biblical texts. Now, what they did was they looked at how oral bards and poets recited using memory techniques and oral methodologies, how they recited poems and epics, the performance context of where they recited them, and what they knew about that. Then they looked at biblical narrative, especially parables and aphorisms, and said, what can we now learn based off what we know? Well, it turns out there's a limit to what you can learn using that method, and in the past 2 decades, form criticism has really kind of slowly fallen out of favor, at least diminished. What I'm going to do in these next series of presentations is sort of reinvigorate form criticism by walking through a different door. I'm not focusing on parables, aphorisms. I'm not focusing on how oral bards communicate. I'm slowly going to go backwards in time, looking at how societies transmit information of all kinds until we get back into the oral world. And once we're there, we will find sort of the bedrock of the cosmovision of these ancient religions, including ancient Israel. And then we'll have some new tools by which to look at the oral tradition and the biblical text. So, let's begin. In 1965, I believe, a man named Marshall McLuhan wrote a book, Understanding Media. It took the world by storm. McLuhan had a genius insight that could be summed up in this phrase: the medium is the message. McLuhan's insight was that human beings communicate, and we listen to each other for the messages that we share, but it turns out the way the messages are communicated, the medium of the message, is more important than the message itself, because it's the medium that structures civilization. It structures social relationships, economic relationships, political and intellectual relationships. Well, when he wrote this book, the computer had just been invented, and it took the world by storm in part because people wanted to know how this new technology would transform civilization. Almost nobody took his insight and went backwards in time, which is what we are going to do. But let's illuminate this idea: the medium is the message. And I thought to do this, I would just give an example of a watering well and how establishing a well actually transforms the world around it. So here we have in this upper right picture, a picture of an oasis in the Middle East, and I've circled the water well that people go to. Someone dug a hole. Water comes out of the hole. People go to the hole for the water. The water is the message, right? But the medium is the well, the hole. Well, what happens when you dig a well? Well, the first thing that happens is people start going to the well, right? And that's where they get their water. They go every day, and so they start talking to each other, and the well becomes sort of the newsstand. This is where people share the news. What's Bobby doing? What's Sally doing? Who's marrying who? What's going on in the village over the hill? And this is where your network of ideas happen. In fact, true story, there was a village middle of the 20th century in India, a remote village that got their water from a well. They'd fill pots daily and bring their water from the well. And the government brought in indoor plumbing. They actually brought in pipes into some of the buildings in the villages and said, hey, you don't have to go to the well anymore. Turn the faucets on. It's instantaneous water. Voila, we're modernizing your village. Well, within a few months, the village elders tore out all the pipes. And when the government asked them, hey, what did you tear out all the pipes? They said, well, we stopped talking to each other. And literally, that they stopped meeting at the well and sharing community. And when they realized that this was what was going to happen, they tore out the pipes. So literally, the well is the place where people meet and share information. By the way, in the Bible, whenever a bachelor wanted to meet a mate, he would go to a well because that's where the women were gathering water. The well was sort of an ancient versions of the single bar. Right? Well, look at this picture in the upper right, and you see they've built troughs, which they fill with the water from the well, and this is where they water their animals. Well, suddenly you got half a dozen people bringing their animals, and they start saying, hey, what will you take for that goat? What will you take for that cow? And a marketplace is established near the well where the trading, buying, and selling of livestock and other goods is established. And so not only do you have a newsstand, you have a marketplace. And if you have a marketplace, then suddenly the power of the state is interested. They can tax the roads to the well or the marketplace itself, and you get government intervention to maintain the environs of the well. McLuhan said, the medium of the message actually structures the way we think. This might be a little more esoteric in the example I'm giving, but how would a well structure thought? Well, it turns out it did for almost all of human history. So as an example of that, in the early European villages, such as you find in Switzerland or Austria, in the earliest villages, the center of town was always a well and a tree. And this descended actually from pre-Christian Europe, where, the pre-Christians established the sacred center of the village by digging a well and planting a tree, or digging a well near a tree. And this came from their cosmovision, where the universe was represented by a tree that drew up its nutriment from the waters of life, which was represented by the well. And so you cosmicized the land and put a village in it only by creating the sacred center, the well and the tree. Well, when the Christians came in, very often the tree was cut down, the well remained, and a church was built at the site. And so in these early European villages, the center of every village is a church and a well. And again, sometimes the tree survives, but originally it was the church, tree, and well. In Norway, you have these stave churches that actually are built as trees. The church itself has a structure of a tree, or even a tree within it. And this, there you have it. Well, so the bottom line is, every time you go get water from the well, you associate it with the church or the tree, and then you think that all the water you get is part of a divine process, the waters of life by the sacred center, either the tree or the church, and you relate the two. Well, this has been going on for thousands of years, and this is how a well might structure thought, right? Because it's part of your religious cosmovision. McLuhan had a very important insight, and that is the content of one medium will be another medium, very often the previous medium. So while the medium will structure thought, the medium is composed of previous mediums. We will build on that as we go on with these presentations. So the bottom line is this: if you innovate the medium, the entire structure of society will change. Just on the previous note, the content of one medium will be another medium. That's why I have this bottom right picture. That's a natural watering hole that forms with the collection of rainwater. And, that's the precursor to the well. And, hunter-gatherers would mark where natural watering holes were, because that's where the game would gather to get their water. And this is how they followed the food supply in many regions. All right, so you innovate the medium, you innovate the structure of society. Well, let's give an actual representation of this in history. And in doing this, I've decided to start towards the latter end. I'm not going to talk about the technological revolution of the computer, of emails. I'm going to start with the printing revolution, the invention of the printing press, 15th century Europe. This is the European printing press. The Chinese actually invented a printing press far before the Europeans did. Theirs was more of a kind of like a stamp, a porcelain stamp press. And we'll talk about that as to why the printing press in Europe transformed Europe in a much faster pace than it did in China in a future presentation. But let's look at how the invention of print culture transforms Western civilization. To do this, I am going to quote from a 3-volume work, Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Revolution in Europe. I know it sounds terribly boring, but it turns out to be one of the most fascinating books I have ever read. There's actually a 1-volume, condensed version of it. And if you have a free weekend, I suggest you read it, because she goes through and tracks all the transformations that occur in Europe due to the invention of the printing press, and the connections that she makes sometimes are stunning, and you realize, oh my goodness, this really is a game changer. So in order to do that, I am going to have to, I'm just going to read some paragraphs. I normally don't like doing that in these presentations, but let me just read from her work. Here are some social and economic consequences of the printing press. Quote, as communion with the Sunday paper has replaced church-going, there is a tendency to forget that sermons had at one time been coupled with news about local and foreign affairs, real estate transactions, and other mundane matters. After printing, however, news gathering and circulation were handled more efficiently under lay auspices. The displacement of pulpit by press is significant, not only in connection with secularization, but also because it points to an explanation for the weakening of local community ties. To hear an address delivered, people have to come together. To read a printed report encourages individuals to draw apart. End quote. All right, so, one of the things we forget is the early church, the medieval church, was the place where you also got the news. It was where the well was at, and in many cases, literally. And so this is where you got the news. Part of the priest's job was to give local news, wedding announcements, real estate announcements, news announcements, announcements from the government, etc. Right? The printing press changes this. Suddenly, people don't go to the church for their news. They can read it in a newspaper. And so this begins the long process of decoupling the church from secular matters. And this just continues until there's a full secularization of the state. But the other thing here is that, I don't need to hear the sermon. I just go for the news. So a lot of people no longer go, and that does weaken community ties because they no longer meet. There's that whole example of the Indian village that tore out their plumbing pipes because they no longer met at the well. All right, here is another example. As long as texts could be duplicated only by hand, perpetuation of the classical heritage rested precariously on the shifting requirements of local elites. Texts imported to one region depleted supplies in others. The enrichment of certain fields of study by an infusion of ancient learning impoverished other fields of study by diverting scribal labor. Systemization came only after the humanist impulse could be combined with new features supplied by print culture. End quote. Well, this is a radical insight Eisenstein has, in that in manuscript culture, which is the previous medium of print culture, it's very expensive to reproduce a text. In fact, a technical text like an almanac or scientific tables could take over a year to copy, right? And so you have, and you only have, 20% at most of the population literate. Half of them are probably monks who are copying the text in the monasteries. They are paid to do it by the local elites. The only ones who could afford to pay to copy texts were the local elites, who are the only ones who could read, besides part of the merchant class. And so you have the religious class, the royal elites, part of the merchant class, that are really the ones paying for the duplication of text, which is a slow, expensive process. And if you're duplicating a text over here using this monastery, you're not duplicating other texts, and you're paying them, drawing them away from other areas of the countryside. And so really it is the compartmentalization of knowledge and of ownership of knowledge. This is often cited by secular atheists as the control of religion over people, but really it's the nature of the medium. In manuscript culture, you don't, mass education and mass reading and all that implies comes only after the invention of the printing press. All right. Here are some intellectual consequences of the printing press. Quote, during the first centuries of printing, old texts were duplicated more rapidly than new ones. On this basis, most authorities conclude that printing did not speed up the adoption of new theories. But where did these new theories come from? Much as maps from different regions and epochs were brought into contact in the course of preparing editions of atlases, so too were technical texts brought together in certain physicians' and astronomers' libraries. Contradictions became more visible, divergent traditions more difficult to reconcile. Not only was confidence in old theories weakened, but an enriched reading matter also encouraged the development of new intellectual combinations and permutations. Increased output directed at relatively stable markets, in short, created conditions that favored new combinations of old ideas at first, and then later on, the creation of entirely new systems of thought. End quote. Well, again, in manuscript culture, this is a very important insight. In manuscript culture, it's so expensive to copy a text. What text do you copy? You copy the authoritative text everyone agrees is the truth, right? And so you're copying the center of your tradition, and that is the cornerstone of your intellectual library. You're copying the classics, and you looked into the past for truth. With the invention of the printing press and an explosion of cheaper texts, suddenly libraries were being filled with books. And if you have a certain book on a certain scientific topic, that's classical learning that everyone agrees on, but now you can afford a half dozen other books, and you bring them together for the first time, you start seeing, oh my goodness, this book contradicts that book. This book has a different idea. Which tradition is correct? Right? These contradictions become more visible. And then you start asking which is correct, and realizing that you don't know exactly which is correct. You have to go out and prove it yourself. This provides the basis of the scientific revolution. When people start comparing divergent ideas, looking to correct them, find the correct one, and developing a method by which you can establish the correct one, and suddenly new systems of thought are created entirely. Indeed, within 2 centuries after the invention of the printing press, more new ideas had been established than in the previous 20 centuries. More scientific ideas. The expansion of learning exploded. This is our intellectual scientific revolution, underwritten by the invention of the printing press. And of course, if the printing press revolutionizes intellectual thought, it also certainly revolutionized social constructions in religion and in political concerns. What we do know is the Great Reformation, 16th century, Martin Luther departs from the Catholic Church and uses the newly invented printing press in a way that had never been used before as propaganda in mainstream media. Over 300,000 pamphlets were printed by Protestants, flooding European markets, advertising, marketing the Reformation. Indeed, the Catholic Church, who had their literate priests reading Latin and giving the news at the pulpit, could not compete with the avalanche of print material being produced by the Protestants. And this becomes key in establishing, entrenching the Reformation in Europe. Well, what the Protestants did to the Catholics, soon the Americans would do to the British, and the state and the French would do to the French, because it's the invention of print culture which not only combines new ideas and a new political philosophy, is evolving from a long tradition of evolving political philosophy coming out of the Christian Middle Ages. But the printing press is being used radically to advertise the ideas of the revolution. The early pamphlets and newspapers of colonial America was used specifically for this process. And of course, nothing has changed in the mainstream news media today. And finally, we also get the rise of secularism. The separation between church and state actually begins as a Christian movement. Most Christian sects were complaining that a few Christian sects were being preferred by the political halls of government, and they established that every sect should be treated the same. But eventually all sects should be separated from the state was the decision. This really gives rise to secularism. And all of these things are predicated in a print culture that can use not only the printed materials, but a rising literate people to create new ideas and new social relations. So, the medium is the message. And if you transform the medium, you transform economic, social, political, religious, intellectual ways of doing your culture. All right, I have started here at the end on the right with primary print culture. In the next few lectures, I am going to take this idea, the medium is the message, and I am going to go backwards in time. What is the previous medium of print culture? Well, that's manuscript culture. And what is the previous medium of manuscript culture? And the previous medium of that? Well, here we are, and once we get into oral culture, we will have a long line of how these mediums transformed thinking. And when we start getting the contours of these transformations, we can start entering the ancient world with a little more awareness. So many things are so strange in the ancient world, from polytheism to how concrete thinkers they are, how ritualistic they are, the human sacrifice. All of these things are just strange, bizarre. We relegate them to just primitive thought, proto-thought, as something completely other. Well, really, we can track all of this through the mediums of messaging in culture. And once we understand the epistemology of orality and how everything outflowed from it, then a lot of ancient history suddenly starts to come into focus. Which means a lot of biblical history gets a new look-see. Because biblical history, the history of the Israelites, exists within proto-literacy, secondary literacy, or primary orality, right? Most people in the ancient world could not read or write. They are dealing with completely different mediums. And even as the printing press transformed civilization, we can look back and see how oral peoples operate their civilization. And from that, we can start looking at some of the narratives in the biblical text and give some new readings based off their mediums.